Hey gang, I just want to go through the intercultural differences to make sure you have a firm grasp on them. I will also post this PowerPoint as just a PowerPoint so you can read it and review it because I'm going to go very quickly. This could be a really long lecture. Intercultural communication is something that I teach as a semester long course. So this is just a brief overview of Hostiti's intercultural differences, variations that you have to be aware of when you are presenting to different audiences. So we understand cultural variations are things that are basically passed down through communication. Your culture, when you're born, you receive your culture from your family. So the traditions that they uphold or the traditions that they pass on to you. Thought is very much a cultural thing. The way that you think is very much passed down through communication in your family. Now, these are things that you also kind of choose to maintain. Um, when you're very young, you don't have a lot of choices in that. But as you get older, people do uh, make different choices as to what cultural traditions they are going to maintain and those that they are not. So we understand that culture, has everything other than like genetically handed down things. Like if you are a type 1 diabetic, that is not necessarily a cultural thing that's handed down, although there is a culture surrounding type 1 diabetes, and there's a culture surrounding um, uh, people that are hard of hearing or deaf individuals. There's a deaf culture that exists because it really does encompass the way that you think and the way that you communicate. But we are, in regards, you have to really think about like age, gender, socioeconomic status, political perspective, religion. All of these things are cultural variations that you have to take into consideration when presenting. Now, we learned from even communication accommodation theory that we tend to be more receptive to people that we think are similar to us or have things in common with us. So that's why when we want to converge in communication accommodation theory, we tend to pick up the verbiage and the presentation styles of whoever we want to be like or emulate. So recognize that in speaking and presenting, you have to understand the culture of the individuals in the room. And these are things, you can start thinking about cultural variations even in Northeast Ohio. People that live on the west side versus people that live on the east side of the Cuyahoga River. Not, these people can drive to each other's houses. We could go to Beechwood or Crocker Park, and you will see a very distinct differentiation in the cultural expectations and presentations of the people. And really, this is within Northeast Ohio. If you start thinking about Northeast Ohio or Cleveland versus Dallas, there are definitely cultural variations there. We don't even need to cross the ocean to find cultural differences. Where you live, where you are raised, your neighborhood uh, tends to influence your culture, meaning how you receive and experience the world and your expectations. So let's just do a few definitions. Enculturation is how you learn your culture from your birth. So, I'm an Irish Catholic. That was intertwined in my family life from the get-go. My husband's family, there was a strong German presentation. He is a German Catholic, and there's a very strong German influence. So with our children, they have both an Irish and a German influence on their lives. And I think my daughter would like a French, but we don't really have that. I think that would be more acculturation for her. She wants to move to Paris. So acculturation is the process of learning the rules and norms of a culture that you move to. We've all seen that. My dear sweet sister lived and was raised in the suburbs of Chicago, and she moved down to Dallas. And you can't even recognize her speaking down in Texas as if she is from Chicago. She speaks like she is a purebred Texan. Of course, when she comes back to Chicago, she does switch back into her regular, Midwesterner tone and presentation of speech. So recognize the enculturation is how you learn your culture from birth. Acculturation is how you learn when you move to a new place or you are immersed in a different culture. Ethnic identity is your commitment to the beliefs and philosophy of the culture. And sometimes we want to maintain our ethnic identity, and other times we do not. Um, and time and lifestyle and your even your neighborhood play into this. Now, I can tell you, like, distinctly, my grandfather's family, they spoke Polish when he was growing up, but trying to maintain that ethnic identity, they did not want to maintain the ethnic identity from Poland, so they made everyone switch and only speak English in their house, um, because they wanted to be all culturated into the culture of America, which was, an English speaking culture. Now people want to maintain their ethnic identities from other places that they come, and really, it's not a good or bad thing. It really is just the reality of what you want to do. So the relevance of cultural perspective, you want to be aware of, demographic changes, sensitivity to cultural differences, economic and political interdependence, the spread of technology. When speaking to a group, these are all things that influence how they hear your message. So you have to craft your message in a way that will meet their needs. So if you are talking about searching the internet for information, and you're speaking to a room full of 76-year-old women. So you're talking to um, the daughters of the American Revolution, and they're all these little um, older ladies. You may need to present information differently than you would if you were speaking to a room full of college kids that are using cutting edge technology on a daily basis. You have to take those things into consideration when presenting. You have to be sensitive to cultural differences in the terms that you use, in the language that you use. For example, I have actual twins, and they were referred to as Irish twins by friends, and you laugh at that. But Irish twins is actually a culturally derogatory term that refers to the Irish being less intelligent and unable to control themselves. So referring to my twins as Irish twins, they are Irish and they are actual twins, but they are not Irish twins, and that term is really offensive. Now, it was said to me from a friend and laughing about it, but um, you wouldn't say that if you were presenting to a room full of people that may be of Irish descent, because they would find that to be a derogatory term, and it would not be a punchline for them. So you have to take all of these things into account when you are crafting your speeches and when you're presenting your speeches. The aim of a cultural perspective is for your presentation to reach your audience, your message. You want your message, the message that you intend to send, to be received by your audience. You don't want it to be cluttered by their cultural differences and the way that you present, influencing the way that they receive the message. So let's talk about these. These are the classic Hofstede cultural variations. There's individualist versus collectivist orientation. You have to take these into consideration. So individualist culture value the individual. Collectivist culture value the group. So recognize if you are speaking to a room full of people that potentially have a collectivist culture. Collectivist culture, a good example of that would be like Guatemala, or people from Guatemala, or Chinese, Asian descent. Um, they are much more of a collectivist group. They will pass the ball in basketball because they want the team to win. When the Olympic swimmer from Guatemala got a bronze medal at the Olympics, all of Guatemala cheered as if they were Olympic medalists. It's very collectivist. What one does, they all do. But when what one does wrong, they also all do. So if you think of like the movie Mulan, Disney was very good at presenting this topic. She would shame her whole family if they knew that she was doing what she did, but she brought great um, regard to her whole family when she was successful. So collectivist is very much like what one does is responsible to the entire group. Individualist culture, the United States probably is the most individualist culture in the world. we want to score the baskets, we want to win the golds. We watch on the Olympics, like how many gold medals do we have? Are we in the lead for medals? Oh my goodness. And we look at each athlete and make sure they do their best. And it's not a we don't feel like we've won the gold when we see Christy Yamaguchi on the medal stand. Um, Rather, she did, and it's great that the United States did, but we don't think that we've scored the basket when LeBron scores. So we recognize, and again, even with blame, we don't bring parents to jail when their family members do bad things. So recognize the difference between individualist and collectivist cultures, and when you're presenting topics, make sure you take those things into consideration. How are they going to interpret what I'm saying? Um, so even like things like retirement funds. If you are doing a presentation about retirement funds, if you are talking to people from a collectivist cultures firmly believe that their elderly should be taken care of by the young. And like in China, you get fined if you don't take care of your parents. It is a ticket, it is a fine, and you can be put in jail if you are not caring for your elderly parents. Versus in the United States, we couldn't care less about our elderly parents. I don't mean to say it that way, but we are not, it is not culturally imperative that we are supposed to care for our parents. If our parents are destitute when we are in our 30s and we are working a great job, there is no law saying that we have to care for them. We can put all of our money into our own retirement and plan for it. And if you are 65 or 75 and you have nothing in your retirement, it's your own fault. In other places, it is a shame on your family that you are leaving an elderly person without something. So take those things in consideration when you're doing presentations. You have to understand the makeup of your audience. High context versus low context cultures. This is the second of Bastides' cultural differences. So high context cultures assume information is known by everyone. There's a lot of context to the conversation. Information is implied rather than stated up front. They place a high emphasis on relationships. If you've ever done business in China, there's an example from the Cleveland Clinic. They had a Chinese delegation come to Cleveland and wanted to do business with China. They wanted to build, obviously, a Cleveland Clinic in China, of course, but it would be owned, by the government because their government is very different. But they would have a license, yada yada yada. But the story, as the story goes, and this is secondhand, the high context culture of China came to the United States, and the low context culture of the United States wanted to do business first, right? Like, oh, well, let's talk about our plans. Let's talk about the business that we want to do, and wanted to, bring them into a briefing room and give them a tour and jump right into business versus build the relationship. The Chinese delegation wanted to eat together. That's the big thing that they like to do. High context cultures want to build the relationship. They want to know you. They want to know your family. They want to know how you deal with your family. Then maybe if they trust you, they'll do business with you. Versus low context cultures, which is very much upfront and direct communication. Information is explicitly stated. If it's in the contract, it's in the contract. If it's not in the contract and it is not written in that contract, it is not part of the contract. So nothing will be implied. Nothing will be, in this contract or in this business transaction that is not in the contract. Versus in other cultures, a lot is implied. They do business with a handshake. Here, it's not about the relationships. We do business with people we do business with, and we're friends with people that we're friends with. And if we choose not to do business with our friends, it shouldn't impact our friendship. High context culture, that would destroy a friendship. So recognize the difference. Do note that high context cultures are usually collectivist cultures. 15 minutes. I'll try to go quicker. Power distance cultures. There's high power distance and low power distance. High power distance cultures have a huge gap between those who have power and those who do not have power. Low power distance cultures have a very little gap between people who have power and who don't. High high power distance cultures, again, it's easy to talk about cultures where um, like there are very few people in power, oligarchs, um, oligop, like the oligarchs in Russia. There were like what 7 oligarchs, and they had lots of power. And then there were people starving on the street, and the people starving on the street would never think of having a direct conversation with a prime minister or a president. Um, Low power distance cultures, you would. So, like in the United States, I think I can write a letter to the president and he should respond. Low power distance cultures, I think I should be able to talk to the president of the university. His door should be open. In high power distance cultures, a student would never be allowed to talk to the president. The student would talk to maybe a representative or a teaching assistant, and then the teaching assistant might go to the professor, and then the professor might go to the dean, and then the dean might go to the provost, and then the provost would speak to the president. There is definitely a distinct chain of command, and you don't breach that chain of command. You don't marry outside that chain of command. You stick with your own kind in high power distance cultures. That's how class systems are maintained, right? Low power distance cultures, it is very different. The commoner can marry the king, and that's not frowned upon, versus the king needing to marry somebody of common blood. High power distance cultures, to maintain the power distance, the king would never marry a peasant. Now we do see this, and there are arguments that really in the United States we don't have a lot of power if you don't have money, which is the socioeconomic divisive nature. You have no power, but really you can have the tons of money and still have very little power. I mean, you can't change necessarily policy even if you're very wealthy. There's arguments both ways, and we could discuss the philosophy of that. But generally speaking, and according to Hofstadtes, the U.S. would be considered a low power distance culture. We can walk right in and speak to anybody we want to speak to. We can send letters or, address whoever we think that we need to address. Masculine versus feminine cultures. This really describes the focus of achievement versus nurturing. Masculine cultures value aggressiveness, material success, strength, emphasis on traditional gender roles. Feminine cultures value modesty, relationships, quality of life, tenderness. Um, Research has shown that feminine cultures tend to have people that live longer. We will talk, and we may just touch on it briefly, but in my intercultural communication courses, we talk about the blue zones, and the blue zones are really all feminine cultures. There's a quality of life emphasis, there's tenderness, there's nurturing, there's taking care of the elderly, there's family relationships. Masculine cultures are very, machismo, aggressiveness, success, and there are very traditional gender roles within them. And United States is a masculine culture. There's a push for feminine culture values, but really we maintain a masculine culture. And even people that assume non-traditional lifestyles often fall into traditional gender roles, even in the United States. So recognize masculine versus feminine and know what your audience is. Tolerance ambiguity. There's a high tolerance. There's cultures that have a high tolerance to ambiguity. They require minimal communication rules. They tolerate individuality. So these are cultures that are comfortable or can have high tolerance for ambiguous or uncertain situations. So these are cultures, and I would never be able to live there because I'm a low ambiguity tolerant person. I like if you just in certain situations, like if you tell me I'll call you later, later doesn't work for me because there's too much ambiguity in that. You have to tell me what time you're going to call me. Or if you're just going to text me. Like there has to be very distinct lines because I don't tolerate the ambiguity. Later doesn't work for me. In high tolerance cultures, you can say later. I'll talk to you later, and that's fine. We'll meet around noon. Around noon doesn't work for me. I need to know 12:05, 12:15, 12:20. What does around noon mean to you? I need the clarification, but some places are very tolerant and some people are very tolerant. I want you to realize that all of these Cultural differences also fall on individual lines of differences. That doesn't necessarily help you so much when you are talking to presentations of large groups, but if you are in a dyad or intercultural, a two-person conversation, um, recognize that individuals also have varying levels of all of these cultural differences. So those are called the individual construals of this theory. Just so you are aware, low ambiguity tolerant cultures, they feel uncomfortable or can have low tolerance for ambiguous or uncertainty situations. There are strict rules for communicating. It is a highly structured and ritualized interactions. The United States tends to have this low ambiguity tolerant culture. We want to be we are a low context culture, and we don't tolerate a lot of ambiguity. We need to know, does the meeting start at 12 or does it start at 12:15? When I go to the doctor, I get so frustrated because they say your appointment is at 12:05, and I get there at 12, and then 12:05 passes, and 12:10 passes, and 12:15 passes, and 12:30 passes, and I think to myself, my appointment was at 12:05. So why am I still sitting in this waiting room? Like, I am not tolerant of that. I want you to tell me the exact time that I'm going to be walking into the back so that I could have my appointment. Uh, and the ritual and the structure of conversations, we have greetings, we don't just start in the middle. We we have very strict rules. The doctor speaks to us. We speak to the doctor. The doctor doesn't necessarily have to look us in the eye anymore because they type on computers. Um, there's a lot of differences here, and you have to make sure you're aware of them. Short-term versus long-term orientation. Short-term orientations cultures spend resources on present goals and want quick results. Long-term cultures focus on future rewards. This is a huge one that you need to know, because if you're presenting something that is a long-term goal, you have to recognize if you're speaking to people that have a short-term orientation, it's hard for them to think, because for short-term orientations, and I do see that this also cuts along socioeconomic lines. You never know if the money's going to be there. So, it's hard when you think of you're speaking a presentation to a developing country. It's hard for them to believe that the money will be there in the future to maintain this. There is a cultural uh, incentive or orientation to, if you have the money now, spend it now, because you never know when it's going to be there later, or if it's going to disappear, or if the value of the dollar is going to decrease and you're not going to be able to afford that later. Uh, Recognizing those variations when you are trying to present something, especially something with long-term goals, is difficult with people with short-term orientations. If you are presenting a short-term to somebody with a long-term orientation, you have to make sure you're including what the long-term results will be. If we do this now and we do it quickly, it will be beneficial in the short run, and in the long run we will. What are the long-term goals? You have to put those in there. So recognize the differences. Sorry, gang, I had to stop the recording and start a new one here. So I hope that this will be maintained throughout the whole presentation. So we're going to talk about now indulgent versus restraint cultures. So these really are defined along two dimensions: life control and leisure. Indulgence cultures have a high life control, and leisure cultures are generally happy. So, I'm sorry, they have a high life control and high leisure, and they are generally happy. So, if you feel like you are in control of your life and you feel like you have time to enjoy your life, you tend to have more of an indulgence culture, and you're generally happy. Restraint cultures have low life control and low leisure and are generally unhappy. So understand who you're talking to. Do they feel like they have control of their life? We think of these even across individuals. And again, previously I was speaking of individual construals that cut across these cultural variations. And we can see that like socioeconomic status does influence this one. If you have more money, you tend to have more control over your life. And if you have more control over your life, you tend to be able to take vacations and have more leisure involved. versus if you don't know how you're going to pay your gas bill, you don't really feel like you're in control of your life, and you don't really have time to relax. You don't have that leisure. So you're generally unhappy. Recognize the cultural variations. It's unusual to say, but in the United States, you would think we would be an indulgence culture. We have a lot of control over our life. But as you see, there are a lot of people in the United States that really do fall into the restraint culture. So recognize that you have to know who you're talking to because it makes a huge difference when you're crafting your speeches. So, effective intercultural communication, the first thing you have to know is the differences. You have to be aware of things that you need to be aware of, right? If you don't, and if you never thought about cultural variations in your audience, and if you've never heard of these different cultural variations, that's going to be a hindrance to you. You have to really educate yourself on them then. You have to recognize the differences between yourself and the culturally different. You have to um, recognize differences within the culturally different group. So are there differences within the group, and what are differences in meaning? So the way they're going to interpret things. You always want to confront your stereotypes, and this is just generally, but when you're creating presentations, you definitely want to make sure that you are not creating presentations based upon stereotypical information. You want to adjust your communication to the other person or accommodate you know, there's a little convergence that you want to occur because you want your audience and the people that you're presenting to be responsive to your message. And oftentimes that means they have to like you because we don't listen to people that we don't like. And then you have to reduce your ethnocentrism. Um, we tend to think that our culture is the best culture. Of course, I'm Irish Catholic. We're the best. But why would you be anything else? But that is you want to reduce that, especially when you are speaking to people. On St. Patrick's Day, it's great for me to be very proud to be an Irish Catholic. But when I make presentations, I need to, temper that and recognize that there is no one right, correct, all perfect culture. And I need to take differences into consideration when I'm presenting so that I get my message across in the best way possible and it is received in a way that people can use that information.